Rachel stood frozen in the dark living room, her hand gripping her phone as her eyes stared blankly at the screen. Everything around her seemed to dissolve into nothingness. She couldn't hear the music playing softly from the kitchen, nor could she feel David's footsteps approaching from a distance. All that remained were the messages on her phone, the words she knew would change everything forever. David knew. She was certain of it. Every time he walked into a room, his gaze lingered on her for a moment too long, a look filled with suspicion and doubt. But tonight, he hadn't come in after a long day at work like he always did. There were no idle questions or excuses to explain the silence. Just the stillness, thick and suffocating, like the air before a storm. She hadn't expected this moment to come. It all started with fleeting glances, casual conversations at work meetings. But then, just once, a touch of the hand, a smile from Michael, everything changed. She couldn't resist it. She had tried, really tried, but the attraction he held for her, the attention David no longer gave her, all led to a decision that she now had to face the consequences of. Suddenly, the bedroom door creaked open, and David's steady, heavy footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. She couldn't stop now. She had no choice but to face this truth. He was coming, and this time nothing could save her. The living room door swung open, and his gaze, cold as ice, sliced through her heart like a sharp blade. "Rachel!" His voice was low, filled with a coldness she had never heard before. He stood there, not moving, just watching her, as if waiting for an explanation. But she couldn't speak. Every word caught in her throat, guilt and fear flooding her chest. David stared at her for a long moment, then finally spoke, his tone firm. "I know everything." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Everything she had tried so hard to hide, all the secrets, he knew them all. The air around her seemed to close in. A chill filled the room, and only questions swirled in her mind. How could she fix this? How could she explain her betrayal? But those questions were now meaningless. David knew, and nothing could change that. He looked at her with steady intensity before turning on his heel and walking away without saying another word. But in his eyes, she saw it all, the disappointment, the pain, and the separation she knew was inevitable. Rachel sank down into the armchair by the window, where the soft evening light filtered through, but all she could see were the foggy thoughts clouding her mind. She remembered that night with David so clearly. She had been 22, full of dreams, craving a stable life. David was the first person to make her believe that love could be real, that it could be achieved, not just a distant fantasy like she had always imagined. He was smart, caring, and most of all, he made her feel safe. That feeling of being loved was something she had never dared to dream of in the past. Before David, her relationships were fleeting and full of hurt. She once loved a man who lied to her from the start, and when the truth came out, her heart shattered. After that, Rachel decided she would never allow herself to fall into such a situation again. She needed someone who could offer her safety, stability. And David, with all his sincerity and dedication, had been that person. She remembered so clearly when they first met, his gaze was more than just a look. It was filled with understanding, a sincerity she had never seen in anyone else. David wasn't the type to openly express his feelings, but he always knew how to make her feel like she was the center of his world. Their evenings together, their conversations about the future, their plans for a family made Rachel feel happy and hopeful. But as time passed, everything began to change. What she once thought was stability gradually became boredom. Those peaceful evenings together were no longer there. David, though still loving, had allowed his work to consume him, and their conversations became sparse. Rachel felt herself fading into the background of his life. She was no longer the woman he cherished every day. She was just another part of his busy life, an essential part, but lacking the attention she once had. In those moments, Rachel couldn't help but remember what she used to have. The short-lived relationships of her past, the passionate emotions that, though brief, made her feel alive, made her feel like a part of a world full of feelings. And it was in those moments, when she felt the coldness creeping into her life with David, that those feelings resurfaced, making her think about what she had left behind. Michael appeared like a new wave, gentle yet sweeping everything away. He was a completely different man from David. Not because he was more accomplished, but because he brought feelings to her that David no longer could. Casual chats, subtle glances, and then, one time, an irresistible kiss. It came like a wave, sweeping away all of her reasoning, like a cool breeze in the heat of a summer day. Rachel didn't know when she had lost her clarity. The events that had led her here were a blur, moments slipping through her fingers like sand. She couldn't remember what had happened in her mind, the precise moment when everything started spiraling. All she knew was that the secret meetings with Michael had become more frequent. And in those moments, despite the fear, despite the worry about the consequences when the truth inevitably surfaced, she felt alive again. The feeling of being wanted, being noticed, everything she had craved for years. Michael made her remember the first stirrings of love, the excitement of being seen and desired for the first time. But now, standing in the face of this brutal reality, Rachel understood she couldn't run forever. She couldn't hide from what she herself had created. The price for her choices was drawing near, and no one could save what had already been lost. Rachel stood by the window, staring out, but all she saw were the dim city lights. Tonight, like every other night, sleep evaded her. The emptiness gnawed at her, unease settling like a weight she couldn't shake. Her relationship with David had faded, a shadow of what it used to be. The shared moments, the long nights together were no longer there. She didn't blame him. David still loved her, but his work, the pressures of life, kept him from giving her what she needed, what she longed for. The feeling of being abandoned, forgotten in her own home, had slowly consumed her over the years. One late afternoon, passing by David's office, she saw him lost in his computer screen, and something snapped. She wasn't sure why, but in that moment, she felt an overwhelming urge to feel something different. She turned back and called Michael. She didn't know why. She just knew that, in that moment, she craved the kind of attention, the kind of connection that had been missing from her life. Michael was a stranger in her life, someone who made her feel safe, but also someone who brought excitement, emotions she had been missing for so long. When Michael invited her out to dinner, it was the first time in months that Rachel felt her heart race, not because of her responsibilities as a wife or mother, but because of a deep-seated need that had been neglected for far too long. Michael said nothing but smiled when she agreed. They met at a quiet restaurant, the warm golden light casting a soft glow over everything, the atmosphere light and open, allowing her to momentarily forget the guilt, the doubts. He wasn't rushed. He didn't push his attention. His intriguing conversation, the subtle glances, made her feel special. The evening passed without mention of family or responsibilities. It was just Rachel and Michael, as if the world outside didn't exist, as if nothing else mattered. She knew she was treading a dangerous path, but in that moment, she didn't care. She wanted to feel alive again, to experience the passion that had been lost in her marriage. As they stepped out of the restaurant, he gently took her hand, leading her through the quiet streets. The world around them seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of them. Michael walked her back to her place without hesitation. No awkward silence, no turning back. The scene wasn't clear in Rachel's mind, but she knew that, for the first time in years, she felt the thrill of desire. Michael wasn't the first to make her feel this way, but he was the last who made her unable to stop. When they entered Michael's house, there were no words. It all unfolded naturally, as if everything had been set in motion long before. A quick kiss, an urgent embrace, and then moments where Rachel couldn't control her emotions. She didn't have to worry about what would happen next. All she knew was that in that moment, she wanted to be loved, to feel alive. When she left Michael's house the next morning, everything felt like a hazy dream, too foggy to remember completely. She returned to her home, where David was still taking care of the family, still loving her in his own way. But inside Rachel, an undeniable sense of unease grew. She began to fear, but it was that fear that made her more curious, more driven to explore these emotions she hadn't felt in so long. She knew she had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. Every time she met Michael, those feelings resurfaced, stronger than ever. She couldn't explain what had drawn her into this whirlpool, but she couldn't stop. The danger, the thrill of the unknown, it was everything she had been missing. And it was that very emptiness that had pushed her into this risky affair, an affair from which she now couldn't escape. Everything had gone too far. Rachel knew she couldn't turn back, even though she was well aware that the truth would never remain a secret forever. That night, when her phone rang, the light from the screen seemed to invade her quiet world. She knew, the moment she saw the caller's name, that this was the moment it would all unravel. David no longer had doubts. He knew everything. She felt every breath of hers stop for a long, unbearable moment. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. Each beat felt like a knife slicing through her. David was home, just like every other night, but tonight was different. She could feel the change in the air, a coldness that enveloped them both. He didn't say anything as she entered the living room, his eyes cold as ice. It was a look that spoke of someone who no longer trusted any lies, someone who knew exactly what was happening but was waiting, trying to remain calm, for an explanation. Rachel couldn't lie anymore. She stood there, in the middle of the living room, her hands trembling, unsure of what to do, but she couldn't run. She had avoided this moment for too long. Her apologies suddenly felt meaningless. She had deceived David, not just once, but many times, and now, standing before him, she couldn't justify her actions. "I can't keep living like this," David spoke, his voice soft, but full of pain. "What did I do wrong for you to turn to someone else?" The question choked Rachel. She couldn't answer it because how could she explain that it was all due to a feeling of lack of attention? Lack of love? How could she explain that she was seeking something not out of loyalty but out of a desperate need for passion? Something she had been missing for so long. Those questions pierced her heart like an arrow. David moved closer, his eyes still cold, but within them, there was something Rachel couldn't touch hurt. Disappointment. "I have always loved you," David said, each word slow, as though he was trying to contain the anger rising within him. "I have always been here for you. But you." He didn't continue, but Rachel could see everything in his eyes, everything he couldn't say. A long silence followed, and then, suddenly, like an explosion, David dropped his hands. "You've ruined everything," he said. Those words were like a verdict, a declaration that everything between them was over. Rachel felt the air in the room thicken, suffocating her, each breath harder to take. It was in that moment that she realized there was no going back. She had crossed the line of forgiveness, and now nothing could save this relationship. Rachel looked at him, tears starting to fall. She wanted to apologize, but deep down, she knew that an apology couldn't undo the betrayal. She looked into David's eyes one last time, seeing a man who had once been everything to her, now a stranger. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. "I want you to leave," David replied without hesitation. "I can't live with a woman who has done this to me. I can't." Those words were like a sharp knife piercing Rachel's heart. She couldn't believe that it had ended so quickly. David didn't just want her to leave. He wanted her to disappear from his life completely, with no trace, no remnants to hold on to. In that moment, she understood that, no matter how hard it was, she had broken everything she had built. She had lost the man she loved, and now, all that was left was emptiness. As Rachel stepped out of the house, there was nothing but tears and pain. She didn't know where she was going, only that her heart had shattered. The city still turned, the world continued to move, but inside her, everything had come to a halt. Rachel walked out of the house, each step echoing in the quiet night, like the final notes of a song that had ended. She didn't look back, didn't dare to turn around. The cold, biting air felt as if the world had shut itself off behind her. Everything seemed to be surrounded by an invisible wall she couldn't break through. The emptiness and loneliness inside her began to consume her thoughts, leaving her unable to think, unable to understand herself. What had she done? How could she have lied, betrayed the man she once loved more than herself? All the apologies, all the promises she had made, they now felt hollow, unable to undo anything. She thought of her children, their innocent faces, and her heart twisted. What would they think of their mother? She had lost everything, not just David's love but the trust, the respect she once had in his eyes. Rachel didn't know how long she had been walking, only that she was moving through a world that felt alien. No home, no place to return to. Each step was a farewell, not just to David but to the life she had once dreamed of. She looked up at the sky, but all she could see was the pitch-black darkness. No light, no hope, only emptiness. The days that followed were long, painful ones. She no longer had the comfort of her familiar home, no longer saw the faces of loved ones every morning. She sought refuge in a temporary apartment, a cold, empty place that mirrored the emptiness in her soul. Each morning when she woke up, she was overwhelmed by a sense of void, no longer finding the peace, the safety she once felt within her family. David remained silent, as if nothing could be said to change anything. She sent messages of apology, tried reaching out, but they were like whispers carried away by the wind, leaving no trace. He did not respond, did not call. It was as if everything had ended, even though she still loved him, still wanted to go back. But deep down, she knew that perhaps it was already too late. Rachel no longer held onto any hope of salvaging anything. She had chosen this path, and now she had to face the truth. The pain, the regret that couldn't be erased, was hers to bear. She looked at herself in the mirror, a woman who had lost herself in the pursuit of a feeling she couldn't even name. David didn't call, didn't he text, didn't he come to find her. His life continued with its responsibilities, its plans for the future. Rachel knew that he would never return because trust had been shattered beyond repair. And she, after all that had happened, was left alone in a life filled with shadows. In the end, she realized that sometimes we can only move forward in silence, unable to mend what has been lost. But at least, Rachel knew one thing, that at the depths of her mistakes, she had learned a painful, yet invaluable lesson about love, loyalty, and respect.